All right, why don't we do a brief review on the anatomy of your respiratory system? Last semester we spent a lot of time much more in depth at the various anatomical structures. So let's just do a brief overview on the key issues that we are going to address for physiology component of this. Now, as you recall, the respiratory system can be organized two different ways. There's the structural organization, and structurally organized, it can be broken down into your upper respiratory tract, which would include all those structures superior to the larynx. So you're looking at the nose, your nasal cavity, nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, the sinuses, all of those structures. And if you hear of somebody having an upper respiratory tract infection, those are the structures that you would be concerned with. The other organization on here would be the lower respiratory system, which would include the structures from the larynx inferior. So we're looking at the trachea, the bronchi, the alveoli, lungs themselves. Okay, so those are your lower respiratory tract components. And if somebody had a lower respiratory tract infection, you're thinking of those structures, or like pneumonia, something that would involve the lungs itself. The other part of the way the respiratory system is organized is you can look at it functionally. So structurally is on one hand, functional organization is another. The functional organization can be broken down into two zones. The first zone being the conducting zone. And the conducting zone just allows for the passage of air or gases to go through it. Okay, so these are basically just tubes that allow air to pass through it. There's really not a significant function associated with that, or at least for what we're concerned with. Then we have the respiratory zone, and then the respiratory zone is where you have the actual exchange of gases. So let's look at this. So we've got this picture up here, and what we have here, this is just a representation of the bronchial tree. So we're going to have our trachea in this area. Air comes down, air splits off in a couple different directions. This region here is called the carina. Okay, that's at the level of T5 for your vertebra. So that's usually one of the questions you'll see somewhere in your nursing program. That's something that I would put on a test if I was teaching those classes. So we're going to go down to your right and left main stem bronchi, or your primary bronchi. They go to lobar or secondary, tertiary, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And at the very end of the conducting zone, we have what's called the terminal bronchi. Okay, so this is the end of your conducting zone. Okay, and the beginning of your respiratory zone will be the respiratory bronchial. Okay, so that's the direction that we're looking at. So the respiratory zone will include the respiratory bronchial. It includes the alveolar ducts as well as the alveolus. So let's do a little bit more. Well, let's look a little bit more into the alveolus on what those structures are. So let's just roll this over. And this is just a magnification of here. So the blue area, we have the pulmonary artery. The red portion here, those are representing the air passageway on this case. Okay, so we have, in this case, we're just looking at the primarily the respiratory zone. So at this area is your demarcation. So we have your terminal bronchial here. So this is part of the conducting zone. And we have your respiratory bronchial here. So this is the respiratory zone. So you have your respiratory bronchiole, you have your alveolar duct, and the alveolus. Okay. Now, there's no cartilage in this area. This is simply the simple squamous epithelium that allows for the passage of gases to go through that tissue. Now, the alveolus, if you recall, they're just like a bunch of grapes, but instead of just having a separate and distinct grape, each one of these grapes connect to each other. Okay, so this grape and this grape share the same wall, if you will. Okay, and when they share that wall, there's a little opening in between where you can see these little dark spots here. Those are called alveolar pores, and I'll show you another picture in a moment, that allows passage of air from one alveolus to another. Okay, and we'll talk about the reasoning behind all of this. I just wanted to go through the specifics of here. So that's going to be the alveolus. You're going to see the blood vessels going through here. This is your capillary bed. And the capillary bed, when we're looking at this area, is, let me just draw that line, is looking at where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are coming from or going to. Okay. Now, if we do one other thing here, let's go to this image and let's zoom in on the alveolus just a little bit more. When we're looking at this, we just did a cross section of the alveolus, so we just took half of it out. And so this is the air sac in the center. So there's really, that's just the space where air occupies. You can see right in the center, that dark spot, that's the alveolar pore. This is connecting to another alveoli, and it allows for gas to move from one to the other in this case. Now, all the tissue, this is simple squamous epithelium, and there are two types of alveolar cells. There's going to be a type 1 alveolar cell, and this is actually going to be 95% of the surface area. So this is your primary cell that gases are going to diffuse across. The other one is going to be type 2, and this one deals with or secretes a substance called surfactant. And surfactant is an oily substance that decreases the surface tension, and it prevents the alveoli from collapsing when you exhale. So here you've got your alveolus, and when you inhale, it swells up. When you exhale, it comes back down. The inside of the alveolus is a very moist area, and when the surfaces are wet, that increases the chances of the alveolus fully collapsing, so this side and this side would actually touch, which you don't want that to happen because it's much more difficult to then inflate the lung when you're trying to breathe. So we have the type 2 alveolar cells, which secretes surfactant, which is an oily substance that lines the inside, and it prevents the alveolus from fully collapsing down. Okay, so as it shrinks, you have that oil lining that kind of prevents it from collapsing in on itself. Okay. The next thing I want to do is looking at this picture a little bit more in detail, and we're looking at the respiratory membrane. Now, the respiratory membrane is the tissue that oxygen or carbon dioxide has to diffuse across. So we're looking at the membrane between the alveolus and the capillary. Okay, so let me just do a couple things. Let me just draw, let's say this is part of the alveolar wall. Okay, so that's the endothelial lining that oxygen has to go through. Now, one of the things that we also have on endothelial or epithelial tissue is we have a basement membrane. I'm just drawing this basement membrane in green just so you can see the differences. It shows like there's a space in between, but it's actually adhered to that tissue. So let me just put basement membrane. Okay, on that one. And I'm also going to draw a basement membrane on this side, just a different color, just so you can see the differences. Okay, so that's a basement membrane. And what we have, let me just go back to the black on this one. And then this is actually the capillary wall. So we're going to have the endothelial tissue here on this one. So we're going to have, let me just do this in red. So this is a capillary. And so you're going to have your red blood cells in this direction. We're going to have the alveoli on this end, okay? So what we're dealing with on here is we are needing to diffuse oxygen and carbon dioxide across these membranes. So in the lungs, the blood returning to the lungs have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out from the blood into the alveolus. And then we're going to have, let me just do a different color. Let me just do purple here. And then you're going to have oxygen going from the alveolus into the blood. Okay, so it has to go through these membranes in order to be functional. And those membranes are known as your respiratory membrane. The next thing up, let's just do a real brief overview on the lungs. Let me pull up another picture here and we can just look at those here in a second. Hold on. Okay, what I just pulled up here, just an image of a lung. And you should be able to determine by this picture if this is your right lung or left lung. And if you don't know, go back to the previous thing and look at those. But this is going to be an image of one of the lungs, and you can see the different lobes of this one. So this one has going to be 3 separate lobes that are going to be of one of the lungs. And the next one is going to be 2 lobes. So if you don't recall how many lobes are in each lung, this little notch here should also remind you of something, okay? So think of those. And what I wanted to point out on the lungs is you have, I can't draw it on that one. You have a serous membrane that lines this lung, okay? Just like any other serous membrane in your body, you're going to have 2 layers of the serous membrane. You are going to have a visceral layer and the parietal layer. The visceral layer adheres to the organ itself. Parietal layer adheres or is further out from that. So when we're looking at this one, the serous membrane surrounding the lung is called pleura, Pleura. And you're going to have a visceral pleura, which is the layer of the membrane closest or adhering to the lung. Parietal lines the thoracic cavity, and in between this is the pleural cavity. It's a potential space, and it's filled with serous fluid, and it's about 15 milliliters of fluid, so it's not a whole lot, but it's a fluid that's constantly being produced and constantly being reabsorbed by your body, and specifically your lymphatic system. So the next thing I want to look at is I want to look at the hilum on here. No, I don't want those. Okay, so let's look at the hilum in this case. The hilum is a region on each lung where different structures are entering or leaving the lungs, okay? So we're going to have our main bronchi coming in through here. So you can see that these other structures, that's the cartilage. So that's entering into your lungs. We also have your pulmonary artery, pulmonary veins on here. So those are entering or exiting your lung depending on the direction of blood flow. Also in the hilum region, you're going to have the nerves that innervate lung tissue, as well as lymphatic structures that will be exiting the lung, and it's to help remove any debris that's not been cleared out by the cilia in your upper passages, or any excess fluid is absorbed by the lymphatic structures. Let's see. Let me pause here. Okay, for now, let's just finish with the anatomy review on this aspect. If there's other structures that I want to point out, I'll point those out as we go along on the other lectures. I don't want to spend too much time with just this. So all the other lectures will cover any additional information. And the next one up, we're going to look at the mechanics of breathing. So stay tuned.